Hello there, it's Tom here, and this is Chapter 30 of Gunnerkrigg Court, The Coward Heart. Now, this chapter is one that was pretty well received by a lot of readers of the comic, and one that I had a good time drawing and writing, because it brings together a lot of the plot threads that have been introduced in the comic up to this point, and starts to tie a lot of them together, and pushes the plot forward a bit more in regards with John and Smitty and Parley, who eventually end up in this chapter. But here at the beginning, we see Annie and Kat messing around on the steps, and in this last panel here, I have a little callback to the very beginning of the comic, and I just thought it was a nice nod to kind of how the comic has changed over the years. The thing that Kat says here is almost a direct quote to something Annie said at the beginning, and I'm kind of happy that the comic moved away from the sort of intentionally quirky dialogue that I tried to force back then, which ultimately I don't think really worked very well. It helped set up the character of Annie, but it was something that I eventually discarded because I found that it was tough to make the characters really interact believably with each other if, first and foremost, the way that they spoke was kind of artificially stilted or awkward beyond what was required with their character design. And so while it's not something I would go back and change from the beginning of the comic, it does make some of the early chapters sort of stand out a little bit, and I just put that down to me finding my feet and settling into working on the comic. But so the girls are messing around, and this chapter primarily deals with investigating a bit more about Jean, who's at the bottom of the ravine, and they enlist Smitty's help to chuck Annie's blinker stone down there, which leads us to the first of these pages where I draw entirely in the ether, which is one of the things I like best about this chapter. It gave me the opportunity to do a lot of weird things with these sort of sequences, and these are some of the pages I enjoy drawing the most. I think what I like best about these sequences is figuring out the layout of how the page should read. It's almost a puzzle in itself that I find interesting to lay out something like this and try to make sure it's still readable. There are a couple of missteps I made in this chapter with some of the layouts, but I think as a whole it worked pretty well. And I had comments from people saying that they really enjoyed these sections. But so we see here, one of the problems of using a blinker stone that Annie and the audience has not discovered yet is that Jean is somehow able to stop Annie from returning to her body once she gets her hands on the stone. And during this time, as Kat and Smitty are talking, Parley pops in literally, and at this point we are getting hints that Parley still hasn't had a handle on her ability to teleport. But even though Kat's never met either of them really, she's been talking to Annie about the two of them, and Kat cottons on pretty quickly that it must be Parley's unspoken romantic tendencies that causes her to activate her powers. And it's kind of funny to read back these pages and see kind of how antagonistic Parley still is to Annie, considering that they become good friends later on. And this is the chapter where that change really happens in their relationship, and Parley becomes good friends with both Annie and Kat. But before any of that, Parley is suddenly zapped into the ether with Annie, who is trapped, and I get to jump into a fun sequence where we directly see images from Jean's past. And I found working on this part kind of interesting because I definitely wanted to show an adult relationship between Jean and her boyfriend, but of course I had to make sure I wasn't crossing over any lines of decency, and keeping in mind the audience of the comic and what I wanted to show with these sequences. And if I'd have focused on Annie during these sections, I might have been a bit more reluctant to show a sequence like this. But since Parley is here, and she's an older girl, and she's at the time of her life where she is thinking about this sort of thing fairly often, especially in regards to her relationship with Smitty, I was more comfortable showing this sort of scenario with Jean and her boyfriend, as long as I maintained that it was Parley who was the object of focus. We also get a very symbolic look at the moment when Coyote arrives and divides the court in the forest. But because the physical details of that event are really not what's important to Jean here, what actually happened on that day is not really conveyed, just the fact that she and her boyfriend have been separated. And so we go into a sequence of pages that overlaps with what we saw from Diego's point of view a few chapters previously, and we see Jean being lowered into the ravine and waiting on her side of the forest for her boyfriend, after having arranged to meet up with him a few minutes past midnight and presumably go on to escape somewhere together. But we have the reveal that when Stedman fired the arrow into the river, he was not aiming at Jean, he was actually aiming at this elven guy, killing him as he was swimming across the river and somehow trapping Jean down there. And just a point of note, this little sequence here at the beginning of this page, I redrew a bunch of times. Originally I wanted to try and convey Jean's face, turning from a human face into what we see now, but in the end I kind of felt that was, for one, a bit too tacky, and second, I felt that showing her from behind would have left a lot more open to the imagination of the audience as to what her expression might have been. At times I don't think the way that I draw in the comic is really the best style to capture some emotions or expressions that some of the characters might have, and While that doesn't happen too often, I felt that in this particular case, no matter how much I redrew it, I just wasn't doing a good job of conveying the look that Jeanne might have had on her face. So I decided to spin the camera around completely and leave that open to interpretation. And ultimately, I think it works better for that. And it leads to this fun little sequence of motion and showing Parley taking charge of the situation and really enabling the two of them to escape back into the real world. But now that we are back, even though Annie went through the same experience that Parley did, I kind of wanted to make a bigger deal of Parley's experience, because a lot of the emotion that Jeanne had portrayed was in a way directed towards her. And aside from a small hint here that Annie is aware that ghosts and spirits are able to project their emotions onto people like that, we do kind of focus on how Parley reacted to it, and this is the point where Parley gets clued into the whole situation with Jeanne. And really from this point onwards is where I consider the four of them have become friends and they're sort of all on the same page, and Parley makes a resolution to go back down to see Jeanne again. And while they're going to keep the secret between themselves, they've resolved to get ready and try and do something about her. But in the meantime, Parley comes to a little self-realization about Smitty and stops kidding herself about him. And with the revelation that she actually does like him, she's able to control her teleporting power. And we see a little sequence that shows that Kat is a little bit more clued in socially than Annie is. And she decides to leave Smitty and Parley together, I guess to make up for lost time. And I guess a word on the setting of this chapter, while having to lay out and draw the stairs was kind of a pain. I did actually mock up these stairs in 3D, so I had some guidelines to work off. I kind of like the unified theme that it gives to the chapter. It's kind of a unique area that is familiar to readers of the comic that we saw very early on. And this is one of those recurring areas of the court that we quite often come back to, and it's kind of a signature backdrop for some scenes of the comic. And even though full-on romance was never going to be a main area of focus of the comic, I kind of liked ending the chapter with a full-on picture of these guys straight up making out. And I thought it was just a nice way to bring the two of them together. And that's that chapter. This bonus page is just a fun little look at Jones. And we've seen that Jones, previously in the chapters, has tried to push Parley and Smitty together. And she seems to figure out by the series of events that takes place in this bonus page that that's exactly what happened. And I guess you can infer that Parley and Smitty stopped by quickly to play a little prank on Jones, and she is the reason that the two of them ever met. And I kind of like the image of Jones sitting completely alone in a room working, with a party hat on. And that's that. Come back again for chapter 31, Fire Spike.